Hello and welcome to Measuring a Nation's Income. First thing we're going to do is emphasize the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics again. Micro, if you remember, is focused on the behavior of the individual, the household, and the firm, and it studies how people make firms and households make decisions, how they interact in markets, and I want you in a second to write down an example of that. Macroeconomics, if you remember, looks at the big picture and is the study of the whole economy, and including inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. So let's now write down an example for both of those. So write down an example for microeconomics, and then write down an example for macroeconomics. And you can pause the screencast to do that. I will continue, however. We are going to start really the first macroeconomic chapter proper, or the first macroeconomic section proper of the course. And to do that, we actually need to start with a definition. And the definition that we need to start with is measuring the size of the economy. And the size of the economy in economics is usually measured by the gross domestic product. Product meaning production, domestic means in the country, and gross is an accounting term. It can be gross or net. In this case, it's gross. So gross domestic product, or in short, GDP. So when people talk about GDP, you now know a little about what that means. It means the total output, or evaluation of the total output that the country has produced. It measures the total income of everyone in the economy as well, and we're going to get on to why that is in a second. It measures the total spending on all the things that have been produced in the economy as well. Why is that? Well, there is something called the National Income Accounting Identity. And this comes really from the circular flow diagram that we did before, and we're going to do in a second. But if you remember, one of the things we said right at the beginning of the course is that for every dollar spent in the economy, every dollar spent on a good or service, it's a dollar of income to someone. So every time you spend a dollar on something, all that dollar will go to someone. So if you go and buy a drink in a bar, for example, the money that you spend on that will go to the bar owner, it'll go to the people who provided the drink, it'll go to the landlord if the bar is renting from a landlord, it'll go to the bar staff, it'll go to etc. So and to those people who get part of what you spend, that's their income. So you can take that for the economy as a whole. Then it must be the case, if you add up all those separate transactions, that whatever we spend, and we call that expenditure, if we add it up to a macro level, must be income to someone, and we can call that national income. So for an economy as a whole, income must equal expenditure. And here is the circular flow diagram revisited again. Remember, we've got two markets. We've got the market for factors of production, and we've got the market for goods and services. Now, you probably don't remember what the factors of production are, and if you don't, I suggest you stop the playback of this and look it up. For those that do, you know it consists of land, labor, capital. If you don't remember the definition of capital, you should also look that up. And entrepreneurship. The second type of market is the market for goods and services. If you remember, there are really two actors in the economy. There's the households. So that's the really dwelling units, if you like, whoever lives in each household. And there are the firms. The households supply all of the factors of production, and they buy all of the goods and services. The firms pay the suppliers of those factors of production, so they demand factors of production, and they supply the goods and services. Now, what do they pay to the factors of production? Well, to land, you pay rent. To labor, you pay wages. To capital, you pay interest. And to entrepreneurs, you pay profit. So this slide, by the way, I'm looking at right now, on the bottom line there, we're missing interest. And here it is. Now, the key part of it is what we've talked about really so far in the course. The key part of it is, of course, recognizing what happens with the brown lines. We've not really talked about what I had in my diagram usually, the very outer circle of arrows, so the spending by households on goods and services, which is revenue then to firms. Bottom left-hand corner, which the firms then allows the firms to pay the factors of production, so that's the rent, wages, interest and profit. And then that's paid, of course, to the households, and so that's their income. But if there's no leakage from this circular flow diagram, and there's no reason why there should be, certainly not in a closed economy anyway, then you can see that every dollar spent, so by households, so that's the top right-hand corner, whoops, sorry about that. Every dollar spent, that's the top right-hand corner, is a dollar of revenue to the firm, which then uses that revenue, because firms are basically constructs, they're organizational constructs, which is used to pay the households again who supply those factors of production. So every dollar of spending is a dollar of income to someone. So when we look at that outer circle of blue arrows in this diagram, as I was saying, it really should be green. Really what that represents is the money flow around the diagram, and the money flow in return for the production of the goods and services, which is represented by the brown flowing arrows in the top half of the diagram. So the question comes, well, how should we value what we produce? Well, the upper part of the diagram gives you the answer. We should value, sorry about this, we should value the production of goods and services by how much we spend on them, or how much we get paid for producing them. Those two things, by the way, how much we spend on them and how much we get paid for producing them, should be equal. So the blue arrows in the top part of the diagram should be equal to the blue arrows in the bottom part of the diagram. That leads us to two ways in which we can calculate GDP. The two ways we can calculate GDP, by the way, are called the expenditure method or the income method. Now, in these slides, we're actually just going to look at the expenditure method. So, let's get to a definition of GDP. GDP, as I said, is gross domestic product. How is that defined then in economics? Well, this is the definition, and it has 3 bits to it, and I've separated out the 3 bits to the definition. But in total, the definition of GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within the country in a given period of time. So let's go through it individually. So each part of that definition. The first part, market prices. When we say market prices, what we mean is that the value of the good has been basically made in a market. Now, if it's not made through a market, then it doesn't go into GDP. Of all goods and services produced in the economy, when we say of all, we mean all items produced in the economy. They must be sold in a legal market, though. So, for instance, if we have any goods that are produced and sold illicitly, such as drugs, or services that are sold illicitly, such as prostitution in most places, that would not go into GDP. Also, it's going to exclude things that do not go through a market. So if you produce and you consume stuff at home, although it's output for the country, it doesn't go into our GDP. Why? Simply because it hasn't been valued by the market. So for instance, if I decide to clean my own apartment, that will not go into GDP. Why? Because no one's got paid for it. It hasn't gone through a market. There's been no demanders and no suppliers of that service, or the demander and the supplier is the same person. If the demander and the supplier is the same person, then really, it hasn't gone through a market properly. Of all final goods and services, final here, what we mean is that it's at the point where the firm is selling it to the consumer. So if it's a transaction where one firm is selling another firm something, that's called an intermediate good, and that isn't included. An example of an intermediate good might be a miller who sells his flour to a baker, right? So that's a transaction. Does that transaction go into GDP? The answer is no, it doesn't. Why? Because the baker is actually going to make bread. What's sold to the consumer? Well, the bread's sold to the consumer. So why don't we put the transaction where the baker is buying the flour from the miller? Well, quite simply because that's not a final good transaction. And when we buy the bread, we don't buy it without the flour. The flour goes into making the bread, right? So if we did add in the transaction where the miller buys the flour, the baker buys the flour from the miller, then that would be double counting, wouldn't it? Because if we're going to put the price of the bread in, and then we add in also that intermediate transaction, then we will double count it. So we need to make sure that we only consider final transactions. Goods and services. So what we mean here is the tangible goods and intangible services. We've gone through what that means. Produced in a country. It means that they are actually produced within the boundaries of that country. And here we go with that part. Notice it's regardless of the nationality of the producer. So when Toyota produces trucks in the US, then that's part of US GDP. If Ford produces cars in Europe, that is not part of US GDP because it's not produced within the borders of the US. It's produced by a US company, but if that US company does the production outside of the US, then it's not in US GDP. In a given period of time, usually that period of time is a quarter. A quarter is a quarter of a year, in other words, 3 months, or a year itself. That's 12 months, obviously. Now, as I said, there were two ways to measure GDP. One was by the income method, which adds up how much rent has been paid to landowners, how much wages paid to labor, etc., etc. The other way is to look at the amount of spending. So the way in which we do that is to split the spending that's done in the economy in terms of 4 categories, 4 or 5, depending on how you work this out. And the 4 or 5 categories are listed above in this slide. So this is the expenditure approach. We're looking at spending, and we're going to try and add up the total amount of spending in the economy. So on the left-hand side, we start by saying, okay, what do households spend on? Well, they spend on consumption expenditures. Now, so that's the C there. And consumption expenditure can be things like potato chips, movie tickets, motor vehicles, washing machines, haircuts, any of those things. Notice some of them are kind of big ticket items. Some of those are things which last for years, and some of those things I've mentioned might only last 5 minutes. You might consume them immediately. They are all called consumption. The second category of spending in the economy is done by firms. And the spending done by firms usually is called, or is called in this case, investment, and usually consists of the purchases of plant, machinery, and equipment, and putting up new buildings. Now, some of what we call investment is also done by households. And like what, you would think? Well, any of those categories that I've told you about, plant, machinery, and equipment, and buildings, would come under the term investment for the entire economy. So the one thing that households do is they build houses, pay for houses to be built. So if you have a new house built, then that will go into the investment category here. Now, investment is basically adding to the factor of production capital, because we've already said that capital, or the stock of capital, if you like, in the country is the plant, machinery, and equipment that we have. And that classifies as our factor of production capital as well. If we add to our factor of production capital, we're essentially investing as far as an economist is concerned. Now notice we use that term investing in a very different way from the way in which it's used in the papers, in the media as well. Investment to an economist is the purchase of new plant, machinery, and equipment, and the putting up of new buildings. That's what classifies as investment. So to an economist, purchasing stocks or bonds or whatever, that's not investment to an economist. That is not investment. And I'll repeat that in class, actually, because it's so important in economics. The third component is government purchases. So the government spends money on goods and services as well. Like what? You're saying, well, the White House has to buy paper clips, and the White House also, will pay for Obama's meals, so we'll end up buying food. The government will also buy nuclear submarines for the military, and will also buy other things as well for the military. And all of those expenditures go into government purchases or government expenditure. The last item consists of probably two items, or not probably, it does consist of two items in a way. Net exports. Now net, as maybe I didn't say before, but net means with something taken off. Gross means with nothing taken off. So net exports tells you that term consists of something minus something else. So net exports actually equals exports minus imports. Now, why do we add in exports? Well, we add in exports simply because if you look at the right-hand side of that equation, those are the things that we spend money on. But remember what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at how much we produce. So what happens if foreigners buy what we produce? Well, it wouldn't go into that formula, certainly not into the first three components, C and I and G on the right-hand side. So that's why we have net exports, to add that extra component in, to add exports in. At the same time, some of the spending we do is on products that we don't produce, foreigners produce. And so in that C category, and in that I category, and in that G category, there'll be some imports as well. So those have to be taken out, because remember what we're trying to get to here is what we produce, and therefore what we get paid for, the left-hand side of the equation. So it comes out as exports and then minus imports, and that forms the term NX. So NX is sometimes written X for exports minus M for imports. Here we're going to go through the things again. So what are these separate components? I've already really talked about consumption. And what's the exception here really? Purchases of new housing. I mean, everything else that's done by consumers always goes into C. So just the new housing, you've got to remember to plunk that into I. And there is another exception as well, and that's computers, and they're all put into I now as well. Investment, we've said is I, and we've talked about what that is. Now, there's one term I didn't talk about, that's inventories. And inventories, they are things that are on the shelf and that they're not sold. So, for instance, the cars in a lot for a car dealership, they would be part of their inventory. Now, why have we got inventories in there, you might say? Well, because we don't really know where to put that. Those cars are being produced, those goods and services that are on the shelf are being produced, but at the end of the year, at the end of the quarter, no one's bought them. So they're going to be the difference between income and expenditure, or a difference between income and expenditure. And indeed, if we run those up, so in other words, we have an accumulation of inventory, then that tells us that we're producing more than we're consuming. So people are getting paid more, but they're not spending more. So, if we're going to try and calculate how much we're producing and value it, we're going to have to add that fact that, people aren't buying those goods and services that are being produced, add that onto the expenditures that people or households and firms do. So we need to consider that. So that's why it goes into investment there. To be honest, there's no other logical reason why it's in investment. Government purchases we've already talked about. Remember, it could be at a variety of different levels of government, so local, municipal, state, and federal governments. It doesn't include what we call transfer payments. Now, transfer payments are not purchases of things. They're where the government would maybe write a check to someone for whatever reason. They're subsidizing their production, for instance. They're writing a welfare check to a household that's extremely needy. For whatever reason, the government's writing a check and is not actually getting anything in return. That's what a transfer payment is. So the point is, remember what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure how much we produce in the economy. So if we're going to try and measure that by how much the government's spending, then the government better be buying something with it. So that's why we exclude those transfer payments. And we talked about net exports being exports minus imports, and here we see that written out longhand, which is why I said that on the right-hand side of that equation, C plus I plus G, you can either write plus NX, or else you can spell that whole thing out and write it as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Either will work. So let's look at a case study here. In 2009, the GDP of the US was 14 trillion. Now, one thing that economists do is that they try and calculate, well, how much does that mean on average each American produced? So what we can do is take that 14 trillion and divide it by the number of people living in the US. So here we've done that. We get 46,372. The consumption, 32,823 per person. Investment is roughly $5,278 per person. Government purchases roughly $9,540 per person. And net exports are negative. What does that mean? Well, it means clearly that imports are greater than exports, and they come in at negative 1,269 per person. And here we have that split down in the table, and you can see that clearly written. Now we're going to move on to the concept of real versus nominal GDP. So far, everything I've described is nominal GDP. Now, why is it nominal? Well, because we include, in our measure of GDP, we include not only how much we produced, but also how much that production was valued at. So the prices of the products that we produce. Now, what should our GDP really measure? What should our measure of output really measure? Well, it should really measure how much we produce, because I thought that's what we're trying to get at, you would say, or you might say. Well, if that's the case, we need to take out the effect of prices. Why? Because there is the possibility, and in fact it happens quite often, that if total spending rises from one year to the next, and this is what the slide says, then the economy, okay, could be producing a larger output of goods and services, or the goods and services, it could be producing more goods and services and they might be being sold at a higher price, or the economy might be producing less goods and services and goods and services are being sold at higher prices. The trouble is we don't know. So that's why nominal GDP is not really a very good measure of how much we produce. It's a good measure of how much we spend, yes, but not how much we produce. And remember, what we want to get to is how much we produce, the volume of how much we produce. So as it says at the bottom there, nominal GDP just values production of goods and services at current prices. What we want to get to is what we call real GDP in economics. That is, we want to take out the effect of prices. How do we do that? Well, we value how much we produce at fixed prices, so at constant prices. How do we do that? Well, we have to designate one year as some kind of reference year, and we call that in economics the base year. Why is the base year important? Because in the base year what we do is we fix prices at that level, and then we see basically how quantities change. So in the base year, if we're fixing prices at the level in the base year, it must be the case that nominal GDP in that year will equal real GDP. So here's an example. Let's run through this. Let's say that our economy produces only hamburgers or hot dogs. 2010, this is the top part of the table. Hot dogs were $1, 100 were sold. Hamburgers were $2, and 50 were sold. So how much is our nominal GDP? Well, it's very simple to calculate. 1 times 100 plus 2 times 50, which is 200. You could do the same for years 2011, 2012, multiply price by quantity for each good. So 2011 it comes out to 600, 2012 comes out to 1200. Okay, that's all well and good. What about calculating real GDP though? So now we have to fix prices. Well, let's take 2010 as our base year and fix prices at 2010 levels. So how do we calculate real GDP? As I said, remember we're fixing prices, so we just do the same calculations we did when you calculate nominal GDP, except we don't allow the prices to vary from their 2010 level. So in 2010 it's just the same, 1 times 100 plus 2 times 50, 200. It gets a bit more tricky when we get to 2011. 2011, we do not change the prices from 2010, so it's $1 for hot dogs, times, well, how many did we produce in 2011? 150. So it's 1 times 150 plus price of hamburgers. Remember, we do not allow the price to change from its base year 2010 level times the quantity in 2011. So 2 times 100, so that's 200. So 200 plus 150 is 350. So notice this is not what we're getting when we calculate nominal GDP. We're getting a very different measure. Okay, and that gets us real GDP. You can see that in the second kind of table down, third table down, sorry, where it says calculating real GDP. But what it means is that really we're assuming that the kind of average level of prices in the economy went up. Now, how do we get to the average level of prices then? Well, remember, nominal GDP contains both the quantities and the prices. Real GDP just contains the quantities. So basically we could divide nominal by real, multiply it by 100, and we should get a measure of what we call the average level of prices in the economy as a whole, or the GDP deflator. So if we do that, 200 divided by 200 equals 1, multiply it by 100 equals 100. Now, why do we multiply it by 100, because when we calculate indexes, we always have them equal 100 in the base year. So you can see dividing 200 by 200 would have given 1. So don't allow that to be the case in the base year. We're going to have to add up, multiply up by 100. So we do that for 2011 as well. 600 divided by 350, multiply up by 100. You're going to get 171. Same idea for 2012. What we've calculated is a measure of the average level of prices in the economy. When we're talking about the macroeconomy, we have a special name for that. It's called the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator. And here we have a definition of the GDP deflator. So it's ratio of nominal to real times 100. It's 100 in the base year. Measures the current average level of prices relative to the level of prices in the base year. Now, what is the inflation rate in an economy? Well, we've got a measure of the average level of prices now in the economy. Inflation occurs when that average level is rising over time. And we can calculate that as a rate as well. So how do we do that? Well, we just take a percentage change in that GDP deflator index. So basically, we take any, for any calculation of percentage change, the formula is always, the new value, the old value minus the old value over the old value. So that's essentially how this works. So GDP deflator in year 2 minus GDP deflator in year 1 divided by GDP deflator in year 1 times 100. So what do macroeconomists do? Well, they calculate real GDP. That's their first thing that they do if asked to analyze an economy. And in a healthy growing economy, real GDP will be growing over time. And on average, it'll grow roughly 3% every year. And that's been the case in the US until the last few years. I would say up until 2007, that would have been the case. What we find, though, is that growth is not steady. It's not a steady increase in the size of the economy. It's interrupted. Well, first of all, it's up and down, even when it is growing. And secondly, there seems to be these large drops as well. Not large, certainly large in the last recession, but certainly drops in GDP. So in other words, what does that tell you? It tells you that the economy is actually contracting. The number of goods and services that we're producing is shrinking. And when that happens, we call that a recession. Now, the definition of a recession used to be just 2 quarters, consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth or falling GDP. So real GDP going down. Also, we'd expect to see lower income, rising unemployment, falling profits, and increased bankruptcies during a recession. Certainly in this last recession, we've seen all of those things. The shaded, this is a plot of real GDP. The shaded areas are where we've had official recessions. Now you're probably going to ask me, who decides if these recessions are official recessions? Well, actually there's a committee of wise men, if you like, which is called the Business Cycle Dating Committee. It dates when the business cycles are, so these ups and downs, and when the downs occur in particular. And it's part of an organization called the National Bureau for Economic Research, which is set up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You can see this last recession was pretty serious. It's certainly the most serious we've had since the Great Depression. You can see that the down was really very big compared to previous recessions. It also lasted quite a long time compared to previous recessions. So that's GDP. A lot of people criticize GDP. In fact, various people, economists and others, have tried to come up with alternatives to GDP, happiness indexes, for instance, measures of well-being, etc. But it's difficult to beat GDP in a way as a measure of economic well-being, that is. And Mankiw here says it's the best single measure of the economic well-being of a society. And I think most economists tend to agree that that's the case. There are some from other disciplines who disagree. But if you think about it, what are the advantages of measuring the size of an economy by using GDP? Well, first of all, you're going to capture the economy's total income, their total spending. If you get a larger GDP, it tends to mean that each person in the economy is earning more money, has more spending power, and therefore is buying more goods and services. It also means that as income rises, you're better able to afford, as a citizen, certain items, and those items are things like healthcare and education. So a larger GDP is usually correlated with better healthcare, longer life expectancy. A better GDP or higher GDP is usually correlated as well with more education, better standard of education. There are some drawbacks with GDP that I will mention as well. GDP cannot measure things like environmental factors. It cannot measure pure happiness. It cannot measure the weather. All those things go into people's lives and their daily lives, and GDP has no way of measuring that. So, Mankiw's summarized it by saying it measures our ability to obtain many of the inputs into a worthwhile life. I would say here, and this is what this slide summarizes, it isn't a perfect measure. I think most economists would readily acknowledge that. So here are some of the other things it doesn't include. Leisure. That's a very important aspect of life. We don't work like crazy to just get stressed out and die early. The whole point of work is to have leisure, and more leisure if possible. So value of almost all activity that takes place outside of the markets as well is not included in there. So if a society has more charitable work, for instance, that's not included. The quality of the environment I've already mentioned. It also says nothing about who gets that income. We calculated an average level of income for the economy, average level of goods and services produced. Of course, there could be some people in the economy who have fabulous incomes and other people in the economy who have terrible incomes. Remember, that's just an average. So, let's take a case study here. When we look at richer countries, all the evidence shows that they have better life expectancy, better literacy, better internet usage. Poorer countries have worse life expectancy, worse literacy, and worse internet usage. If you're in a country where there's a low GDP per person, there's going to be more infants with low birth weight, a higher rate of infant mortality, a higher rate of maternal mortality, higher rates of child malnutrition, less common access to safe drinking water, fewer school-aged children actually in school. So think about some African countries there. Fewer teachers per student, fewer televisions, fewer telephones, fewer paved roads, and fewer households with electricity. So to end the chapter, here's a nice chart which shows you the effect of higher real GDP per person. You can see in the US is on this chart has the highest real GDP per person as of 2007. It has a very high life expectancy, not the highest, but high, and high literacy as well. And you can see the same types of life expectancy, adult literacy, and internet usage as Japan has. So that's comparing the US and Japan. Germany has a slightly lower rate of internet usage, but still has very good life expectancy and adult literacy. We go down the table, we go to middle income countries like Russia, Mexico. They have much lower life expectancy already, you're seeing. Not so low in terms of life expectancy comparing Mexico and US, but certainly Russia much lower. Little lower adult literacy, but minuscule internet usage as of 2007 compared to the US, for example. And you can go right down to the bottom, say the country like Nigeria, you're looking at real GDP per person of 1,969 per year, 48 years of life expectancy, 72% adult literacy, and 4% internet usage. Nearly everyone goes to internet cafes in those countries. So that really finishes off this chapter, and thank you very much for listening.